Welcome to F4 Talks. With me is Gary Grapple again. As all of you know, or some of you certainly know, Gary is a retired diplomat, a rather distinguished former diplomat. He was ambassador to Oman. He retired as number two to Tony Blair. Well, you were the envoy, I believe, and head of mission at the Office of the Peace Quartet. And Gary is an intellectual. He teaches. He is multilingual, an avid hiker, and a fantastic human being. He was also chair of Fair Observer for many years. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you very much, Atul. It's always very good to be with you.
Uh, Thank you for your time. We've had major developments in Israel. And since you are an expert on the Middle East, you've lived in the region, you have been one of the architects of US foreign policy on the region. My question to you is very simple. What does the arrest warrant of the International Criminal Court for both Israel and Hamas do to the region in general and to Israel, Palestine / Gaza in particular?
Well, Atul, I think the most significant impact of this call for the issuance of arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as his Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and three individuals associated with Hamas, including Yahya Sinwar, who is the head of Hamas in Gaza. But for Israel, the most significant near-term impact is the blow that this will be to Israel's standing in the world, which had already suffered considerable damage given the course of the war in Gaza, and in particular the very serious humanitarian condition that currently exists in Gaza, with so many people having lost their homes, reports of famine or near famine, certainly a dearth of the necessary humanitarian goods getting into Gaza. But this is a real blow because although the actual warrants have not yet been issued, and it's a three-panel judge in the International Criminal Court which will make the decision whether to issue them or not. It's just a real blow to a country that has always seen itself as one of the stalwart members of the international community, particularly among democratic nations. And so we can be sure that the Israeli diplomacy is working overtime at the moment to do what it can to mute the fallout from all of this. We've already heard from the United States. President Biden himself has indicated that this is outrageous, to imply some equivalence between what the government of Israel is doing in terms of fighting the terrorist organization Hamas and what Hamas has done and is doing. And so we have that from the United States. I think Germany has also stood up and questioned. But on the other hand, countries like France, of all countries, has actually endorsed this call for the issuing of arrest warrants. So this could be potentially quite serious for Mr. Netanyahu, who has traveled extensively as prime minister, mostly in order to expand Israeli economic and technology connections with countries around the world. Everyone from China to India, certainly the United States, also because of the political ties, Canada, and all the countries of Europe, as well as Russia. So, although not recently, Russia. So, this would be a real blow to Israel and particularly to Mr. Netanyahu.
So this is a diplomatic disaster with a capital D for Israel. Hamas is not a state actor. Palestine is not quite a state. So it's first of all the fact that it made it to the International Criminal Court is surprising, but more importantly, the fact that you had a warrant out for sitting prime minister. It's very surprising. Do you think the International Criminal Court is overreaching? We saw, some would argue, that it exceeded its remit in Kenya with former President Kenyatta and the now President Ruto bashed up, and the ICC was left high and dry. Do you think the ICC has become a bit like the UN, or the UN is certainly better, but a bit like an international organization without clear charter and clear ramifications um, as to its actions? So you get a lot of mission creep.
I think it's important, Atul, to kind of step back for
Yeah.
a moment and consider these various international organizations that were established in the wake of World War II, which,
When
of
was the
course,
International Criminal Court established?
the Treaty of Rome, I want to say, was around the early 1960s. So we're talking some 15 years or so after the end of World War II. Very much still, however, in the midst of the stark memories of that war and what occurred during that war. And so all of these international organizations, and I include, the ICC, the Criminal Court, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the World Trade Organization, even the United Nations, some of these other international organizations were established when the world was a very different place. The post-World War II era is or was a very different world from the world in which we find ourselves today. I don't think anyone anticipated that we would see countries engaged in out-and-out war against non-state entities, for example. That was probably something that had not been considered, and I think it's fair to say it was not considered, because there was not such a thing, that is, a non-state entity capable of waging a war against a state. But as we have seen repeatedly over the course of the last 25 years, with the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and a number of these other organizations, and not just in the Middle East, non-state actors challenging states and engaged in out-and-out warfare with states, destabilizing states and threatening not only the states in which they may operate most directly, but also surrounding states. And that's certainly the case when we talk about, for example, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah operating in southern Lebanon and in Syria, and some of these other groups. And looking at the specific case of the ICC, they just never contemplated that they'd be looking at a case of a country waging a war against a terrorist organization. They certainly hadn't considered that in the case of Al-Qaeda and the U.S. war against Al-Qaeda after 9/11. And so it probably begs the question, do these various treaties and UN mechanisms need to be reworked? Starting with the United Nations. I mean, it's pretty apparent right now that the Security Council is dysfunctional because of the polarization in that council. Those, mainly China and Russia on one side, the United States, Britain, and France on the other, and then the other 10 members of the council trying to weave a path between them, but not a lot getting done. Even when you have genuine humanitarian crises, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Sudan, whether it's Ethiopia, whether it's Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it cannot reach a decision. And so, and then you have new countries, or not new countries, but countries whose candidacy should be considered for some of these organizations. I'm thinking of like Japan, India, Germany, South Africa or Nigeria, Brazil, countries of that ilk, when looking at the Security Council permanent members. So in the case of the ICC, they are having to grapple with a situation that was simply unforeseen at that time, and how countries might wage wars against non-state entities.
Um, the world has changed. There were non-state actors before. In fact, you could argue non-state actors really did change the world. It was the British East India Company that conquered India. It wasn't the British Crown. And similarly, there were many companies. The Hudson Bay Company operated in North America. We could go on and on. So the reality is, are we just reverting to mean? States sometimes lose their vitality. States sometimes lose their coherence. And today, for instance, in the Middle East, you mentioned the three H's, the three organizations, terrorist organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthis, although some people would call them freedom fighters. These three are now much more cohesive than the so-called state structures. Ipso facto, the world has just changed, and that's just life.
Yes, yes. I mean, and non-state actors throughout history are not are not unusual. I think what makes the circumstances unusual today is that they are waging war not only against other countries, but even inside the countries in which they operate. That is, trying to seize power for various grandiose reasons. I mean, the Hudson Bay Colony, the Hudson Bay Company, it never challenged the crown, would never think of challenging the crown, and the same goes for the British East India Company. They were an extension of the crown, and in many cases they were used by various governments. Now, one can argue that's just what the Iranians are using the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas for, but.
Yeah, the various companies of the Iranian crowd.
Yes, but they're not doing any. They're not doing a whole lot to enrich the coffers, the treasury of Iran, the way the Hudson Bay and East India companies did for Great Britain.
And
So,
they may kill all the Israelis and take their land and grow olives there.
so, but in the case of Netanyahu, it'll be very interesting to see what this three-judge panel decides, how they rule in issuing these warrants. Most people are not going to get heartburn over the three Hamas members, but I think for Bibi Netanyahu, there are other non-signatories. The other one being, of course, the United States, Israel's principal ally, and so in that respect, an arrest warrant would not be so constraining, but still it's the political diplomatic impact of this ruling that has really set Israel on its back foot, and this occurred in a month when things have not gone especially well for Mr. Netanyahu. Last week sometime, Benny Gantz, former IDF commander and former defense minister in Israel, has given Bibi Netanyahu until June 8th to come up with a feasible plan for a post-war Gaza. Bibi has been kicking that can down the road for some time now. He doesn't want to do it. That's probably because it's probably pretty difficult to come up with a viable plan. In fact, it's extremely difficult, even with the help of the Americans and moderate eras and some European countries. It may not even be possible, but that's what Gantz is insisting on, principally because he wants to see some kind of how does this end? A plan for how this all ends. An ending that does not include Israeli reoccupation of Gaza and an unending Israeli military mission in Gaza. Israel cannot afford either one. They can't afford to reoccupy Gaza because of the international political fallout would be so extreme. Even its closest allies would condemn Israel for trying to do that. And on the second score, continuing a military deployment in Gaza is something that's not sustainable. Certainly on the economic side, but also on the military side. Israel faces a genuine existential threat from Hezbollah on its northern border, and of course, ultimately in Iran, and it can't afford to be bogged down dealing with Hamas in a forever war. The United States could do it. Israel cannot. It doesn't have the wherewithal.
What percentage of Israel's workforce is now wearing uniform and in battle?
Yes,
it's a crazy number.
It is, and more importantly, it's some of the key people on which the economy depends. These are folks involved in Israel's tech sector, which is a major driver of the Israeli economy.
Some of the brightest people in the country.
Absolutely. And so these people need to get back to work. And even when they're not actually fighting, they're doing training, they're in R&R from having been fighting for however many weeks or months they have to fight before they get an R&R break. And so they're not
rest
working
and recuperation, R&R, for those who don't know what R&R is.
Exactly. So this is not sustainable over the long term for Israel. It can't expect to get any help unless and until Bibi makes a firm commitment that he is willing to engage in negotiations with the Palestinians on two states, something that he is congenitally opposed to, it would seem.
So now let us break it down. For Israel, this challenge. Israel militarily, yeah, you could argue it's made a lot of progress. It's killed a lot of Hamas fighters. You could argue this has come at tremendous civilian cost, but it may be on its way. However, diplomatically, Israel is now accused of genocide, has repeatedly been accused of genocide. Young people are protesting in West, especially the US, in the Muslim world, and this holds true all the way from Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Iran, and all the way to the Arab world, all the way going to Morocco, and amongst Muslim minorities in Europe and the US. And Muslim minorities in the US are now in significant numbers. There is very strong support for the Palestinians. We can do poll after poll, survey after survey, and you can see that in this section of the population, it's very clear that in their mind, they are convinced Israel is committing genocide. All right? And so diplomatically, that tarring of Israel as a racist apartheid regime conducting genocide against brown Muslim people, combined with the ICC ruling, is a huge hit to their diplomatic standing. And it makes any potential peace deal led by UAE or the Saudis, who have the money really to fund the Palestinian reconstruction, very difficult. So, as I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Israel, to use a British metaphor, is on a sticky wicket.
Israel is facing difficulties on many fronts. We haven't even talked about the conduct of the war itself. Now, I think probably the U.S. hasn't said exactly these words yet, but I think the U.S. may be satisfied now that enough of the displaced Gazans who had gathered in and around Rafah have moved a sufficient distance away from Rafah that the Israelis can begin more intensive combat operations in Rafah to go after what they believe to be the remnants of Hamas that are there. That may be the only bright spot, because otherwise, over the last couple of weeks, we have seen the reemergence of Hamas fighters in areas that Israel previously had claimed as being cleaned of Hamas. We're talking about Gaza City and the refugee camp in the far north, Jabalia. So so Israel has had to redeploy its forces back to those areas, and in order to address the new threat posed by Hamas fighters there, after they thought that they had cleansed those areas. And this reminds me very much what happened to the United States in Iraq, where they would go in and they'd clear out either Al Qaeda or the Shia militias in a particular area and reestablish order and peace. And the Americans leave, and these groups move right back in again. And that led to David Petraeus's plan starting 2007, 2008, where they would go in, cleanse the area, and occupy it so that these groups could not return. The United States could afford to do that. Israel cannot. It's too much of a drain to sit in these areas to ensure that these groups don't reappear. And the principal challenge is not only the resources and the manpower to undertake that task, but the inability of the Israelis to prevent Hamas fighters from moving throughout the extensive tunnel network in Gaza. The Israelis at one time claimed that they had eliminated 30 to 40% of the tunnel network. I don't know how accurate that is, but the upshot, given what we have heard of the last a couple of weeks, is that it's not enough to prevent these fighters from moving to the places they need to go to challenge the Israelis. And this cannot be good news for the IDF. It's going to be very, very hard for them to cleanse, seize, and hold for indeterminate period of time these various areas in Gaza. It's just too much of a drain on their limited resources and forces. So the news is not particularly good there. And then ultimately, personally, I've become somewhat discouraged about how this all ends. How can Israel sort of declare victory, pack up, and go home? I'm not sure that they can, given the current situation. There was much talk earlier on about some sort of an Arab coalition maybe coming in and governing temporarily Gaza until a representative non-Hamas authority could be stood up to do that. It's not clear to me that Arab governments are willing to do that. Clearly, if they were to do that, the United States and other Western countries would want to see the beginnings of some kind of a democratic structure, but there is no...
There's a problem. Sorry to interject, Gary. There's a problem there because Hamas is now popular in the West Bank. And so if you actually did have elections and if Hamas wins in the West Bank, then what do you do?
Exactly.
Right?
And that's what happened.
Guardian Council like Iran, wherein you vet candidates. So democratization is not without its peril. I mean, if you, let's assume the Arab countries democratize and the king of Oman is out where you were posted, and of course the sheikhs of UAE are booted out into the sea and retreat into some island mansions somewhere. Then what happens? You may very well have nationalist Islamist leaders. I mean, lest we forget, if we go back, Gamal Abdel Nasser was extraordinarily popular. He wasn't an Islamist, he was a socialist, but he was extraordinarily popular, and he was fundamentally anti-American and anti-Israel. And so democracy could produce a Saladin in the Arab world who decides that I will take back Jerusalem. I will destroy this crusader state, this modern day crusader state. So democratization is a perilous dance. The Muslim Brotherhood did win in Egypt. We know that. We have a very recent and clear example.
Well, and the elections that were held in Palestine, in which the Hamas were permitted to run, they won.
That was a
And
while ago. They didn't conduct elections after that.
no,
Once
no,
they
they did
won,
not. They have
once
not
they
conducted
won, they
elections
threw
after
their
that.
opponents of the
Yeah,
rooftops
this
heads
is for
first.
the Palestinian parliament, and
Yeah,
the expectation was that they would lose, and
yeah.
that would be their downfall. But they didn't, and so but Arab governments don't have the capacity for setting up the foundation for a democracy because none of them is a democracy. They have no experience, and
Exactly.
so now we face a real problem. But the basic function of administration they clearly could do if there was a security force, non-Israeli there, and it's not clear to me that any of these Arab states is willing to stand up and undertake that task, even in
So
conjunction with other Arab governments.
yeah. So Fatah did it. Fatah tried to police the Palestinians after the deal with Israel. And Fatah was labeled as Judas, and Fatah is finished today. So any Arab government that sends will face an even greater accusation that they are Judases. It'll be Arab on Arab violence. And so this is a very tricky situation. And to bring it back to the Israeli context, there's been a lot of allegations about this being genocide. What is your view? Do you think, as the Israelis have said quite often, that Bibi Netanyahu should be tried for corruption, not genocide? That's his real crime. And they keep pointing out that the casualty figures, the civilian casualty figures for Gazans, which is far more dense, is much lower. It's 1:1, they claim. They say that Hamas's health ministry exaggerates the figures. I have reason to believe that. Everyone has. I think everyone exaggerates. Of course, the Israelis exaggerate too, but Hamas is crazy. And then you have this example that in Iraq, and you would know the figures better, when David Petraeus, General David Petraeus, who's appeared on our YouTube channel, was launching this cleanup. The civilian casualties were, I think, for every militant, insurgent, terrorist they kill, they ended up killing 12 or 13 Iraqi civilians. And they brought the figure down to 1:9 in Afghanistan, and they were very proud. The Americans were very proud of it. But the Israelis claimed that, oh, well, our collateral casualties are only 1:1, and we are taking great care and due care to avoid civilian casualties. So the the argument that we may be disproportionate, we may be misguided, we may be unwise, all of that m- may have a ring of truth, but genocide is a bridge too far, and we do not follow. And this is the key argument they are making: is we do not follow under the legal definition of genocide. Where do you stand on this?
Well, first of all, just to clarify, the recommendation to issue warrants for the arrest of, in the case of the two Israelis, was I think largely based on Israel's withholding of humanitarian assistance at the start of the war, actually using food as a weapon,
I see.
which is strictly forbidden
So it's
under
not casualties.
humanitarian law.
Yeah.
So no, it's not the casualties. It was the use of food and other humanitarian supplies as a
Mhm.
weapon of war, and um, um, Israel has a tough case to argue because early on there were statements made by various Israeli officials suggesting that was exactly what they were going to do, that they were effectively going to wall Gaza off and starve them into submission. And I can't recall the
It is the
exact.
Israeli far right leaders who've been
It is
making
not
such
only is
statements.
look. I think we have to be sensitive to the fact that a lot of these extremely harsh statements were made within the days and weeks following October 7th, when emotions were at a peak within Israel. We have to understand and accept that sometimes human beings will react strongly emotionally to um, to a trauma such as the one the Israelis experienced on October 7th, and made these kind of extreme statements, when in fact that may not have been the ultimate intention. But clearly, for the first few months, it was very difficult to get humanitarian supplies in, and things were far more serious than they are today. Although today I would not want to minimize the degree of seriousness. I think starting in April, particularly when we had that tragedy involving the Americans or World Central Kitchen volunteers who were killed in an Israeli attack, that Joe Biden laid down some pretty firm orders to Bibi Netanyahu, and he did respond. Things started to flow a little more freely, still not meeting the needs of the people of Gaza. There still are food shortages. There are various reports of famine or near famine in parts of Gaza. And so that continues to be a problem. And I think that was the principal hook on which the ICC prosecutor hung his claim that arrest warrants should be issued for these two Israeli officials, Netanyahu and Gallant. So let's see what happens.
So,
I have some doubts that they may go along with this. By the way, the United States government as a whole has reacted very harshly to this recommendation.
the U.S. is not a signatory to the ICC,
No,
International
they're
Criminal
not,
Court. It isn't.
to the Treaty of Rome,
Yeah, yeah,
and nor is Israel.
yeah.
So, and what gives them jurisdiction in this case is that the Palestinians do subscribe to the Treaty of Rome, and so that gave the ICC the legal writ required
Yeah.
to rule on this case. And I'd always felt that the opportunity to hold the Israelis responsible for potential war crimes was somewhat greater than the claim of genocide. And it seems that that's what they have gone for, given the preliminary ruling that the International Court of Justice made with respect to the claim of genocide. It'll be very, as I said, very interesting to see how these judges rule on actually issuing an arrest warrant for Netanyahu and Gallant. The United States, as I was about to say, has reacted very harshly, including Joe Biden, but also the U.S. Congress, to the point of potentially sanctioning these judges should they issue these arrest warrants. That's how strongly the U.S. feels about this.
Yeah. Now, there is the element of religion here as well. Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, is from Mardan. He's a Pashtun. I mean, his father was from Mardan. So not he. He's British. He is King's Counsel. He's a very distinguished barrister. He has served as the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court since 2021, and um, he happens also not just to be someone of Pashtun origin, but he's converted to become an Ahmadiyya. The Ahmadiyya Muslim community is declared as non-Muslim actually in Pakistan. They've been persecuted. They've fled to the UK. Their big mosque is in the UK. They are a very close-knit community. I mean, think of them as the Mormons of the Islamic world, without the 4 wives, of course, or the 5 wives or 10 wives, whatever the Mormons have. But the point is that his wife is a Malaysian lawyer, and Bibi Netanyahu has accused him of being anti-Semitic. Um, there is a feeling that amongst a lot of people that this has been inspired by his deep and devout religious beliefs, this going after Israel. And yes, of course, he has been even handed in to some degree, some would say, by targeting Hamas leaders as well. But really, the target was Israel. And really, his goal is to dismantle what Karim Khan sees as an apartheid state of Israel. Um, do you think such rhetoric has any basis, or do you think it is overblown? And do you think that given this rhetoric, the and given the polarization, the ICC will have much credibility outside its believers, its true believers?
Oh, if the judges decide to issue these warrants,
Mhm.
then all countries who are signatories to the Treaty of Rome will be expected to enforce it, meaning that if the those on whom the warrants are issued appear in their country, they will be arrested and turned over to the ICC for trial. Well, obviously, were this to happen, they're not going to go to those countries. And in fact, we have a recent example of that, and that is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin has an outstanding arrest warrant from the ICC for his role in the mass kidnapping of Ukrainian children and bringing them to Russia, which is just it's an unspeakable evil. And the ICC ruled rightly in the judgment of just pretty much every country in the world. Perhaps not in the case of China, because I think that's the only country where Putin has traveled without fear of being arrested. He did not go to the BRICS conference that was held, I can't recall exactly when, but within the last 9-10 months, that in South Africa, for fear that he would be arrested by South Africa, which is the signatory to the Treaty of Rome. And so that just goes to show you the impact that these warrants can have politically, and that is probably what is weighing very heavily on the minds of these judges as they decide on their action. I'm sure that the case presented by Mr. Khan is well argued. As you said, he's an accomplished barrister in the UK and has practiced in presenting before the ICC. And so it's going to be a very difficult ruling. I'm not going to predict what the outcome is, but if warrants are issued, it will cast further doubt on the effectiveness of these international institutions on which we had placed so much hope in firming up this international order.
So
And,
the
and, and it,
fact that Karim Khan is Muslim and a devout one, would that color the perception, at least amongst the non-Muslim populations around the world? Do you think we've come to that divide, the old fault line, the clash of civilizations that Samuel Huntington envisaged? Are we back to it?
you certainly cannot discount that.
Uh,
You cannot discount factors like religion, nationalism,
uh,
and even political ideology.
I mean,
And so,
Bibi is playing that card. I mean, he's out and out. I don't think Karim Khan has a history of anti-Semitism. I think that is an unfair allegation, but he's made it nevertheless. Boom! I mean,
no,
he's been
yeah,
straight out
I'm,
of the gate.
I'm
He's
not
lobbing
surprised.
grenades.
And it's not the first time that he's played this card. I mean, in
Yeah.
previous elections in Israel, he has spun up Israeli fears of the this sort of a fifth front within
Mhm.
Israel of the Arab Muslim Israelis, and so I wouldn't be surprised that Netanyahu would descend to making that argument, and I think the actual evidence for that is probably non-existent, or even if it is very, very thin, because Mr. Khan is probably very sensitive to it himself and is going to be very cautious. But I don't think it's going to be a very significant defense. I mean, it will play on receptive ears in
I think maybe
Israel
it is
and
not.
other non-Muslim countries.
Yeah, maybe it is not reality, but it is certainly coloring perception um, in places as far away as India, which is also not a signatory to the
Right.
ICC,
Nor is China.
and nor is
All of
China.
these
And
all these big
they
powers.
can't. Yeah, exactly. And in the US, yesterday, for instance, I heard repeated mention among American circles of this fact that the fact that he comes from a devout Islamic background might have influenced his opinion. So we are living in a very, very, very polarized world wherein people are going back to uh, one could all argue the primordial rift lines in society, and uh, we can see Russian nationalism is back. We can see uh, nationalism is back in many other countries. Um, we can see religious sentiment and sectarian sentiment is up as well. After all, what is Iran but a defender of the Shias around the world? And what is Saudi Arabia but a power that is the custodian of the holy sites? So religion is very much in the fray, and as uh, uh, as the rhetoric heats up, these divisions are likely to inflame further.
There's no question. As I said, these factors can never be discounted. I mean, even within the United States, excuse me, one of the most pluralistic societies in the world, we're finding our country divided along these various religious and ethnic lines, and that seems to be a global phenomena at the moment. And so it's not surprising that some individuals would seize this read. Well, Mr. Khan is a Muslim, and that has influenced his decision making on making these recommendations for the arrest warrants. On the other hand, he issued three or recommended arrest warrants be issued for these three Hamas leaders too.
Mhm.
So he could claim in his defense, no, I recognize what these individuals of Hamas have done, and they are deserving of the same treatment. But in the eyes of the world, what is most devastating for Israel is the the way that this is portrayed, that there is equivalence between what
Correct.
Hamas is and has done and what Israel has done.
So,
Um,
in a nutshell, Israel has always been accused of being an apartheid state. Not always, let's say in recent decades. That accusation has acquired resonance, particularly amongst university students um, in liberal campuses around the world. Now, with this judgment, Israel is not just seen as an apartheid state, it is seen as a terrorist state, and that is deeply damaging.
well, not so much a terrorist state, but put on the same level as one,
No,
because
I'm saying for public perception. It's certainly, I wouldn't call Israel by any stretch of
yeah,
imagination a
but
terrorist state. I mean,
essentially employing
yeah,
some of the same tactics,
same methods, yeah,
perhaps that a terrorist
and being
organization
guilty of the same
would use.
crimes.
Yes, and killing innocent human
Yeah.
beings by employing food.
Yeah.
So this is going to be terribly difficult for Israel.
So legally, politically, and diplomatically, this is really bad news for Israel and especially for Bibi Netanyahu.
Definitely. And how Israel, and by the way, it's also very bad for the United States. After Israel is the U.S. has taken the biggest diplomatic hit worldwide because of our support, our virtually unconditional support for Israel. That our stock around the world and some polling is beginning to show this. We had already lost a fair amount just because of some of the very unfortunate events that have taken place in terms of the conduct of our democracy in this country. So we'd taken a hit there, and
Yeah, I
now
mean,
with
January 6th didn't help. I was
oh
there on Capitol Hill
yeah,
that day. You read my piece on it. That
yes,
didn't help for US perception
absolutely
globally.
not, and the continued machinations of the former president are very damaging, and the fact that
Yeah.
he is, we're going to have a rerun of 2020 with the same two candidates is probably not endearing us to many people around the world, and now this war, also the very poor behavior of the United States Congress in stepping up to support Ukraine, or for taking so long before
Hmm.
committing additional U.S. Support to Ukraine, which has put the Ukrainians very much on their back foot. Uh, and that has led to many of our allies questioning, well, gosh, okay, so maybe we can count on the Americans in the short term, but anything longer than 12 months, hey, the Americans are they have very short attention spans, and
Yeah,
they want to get out.
so, but this is separate. This is not just short
Yeah,
attention spans. This is that America will back its allies, come what may. This is in keeping with a broader narrative, which many left-leaning authors have made on Fair Observer. Medea Benjamin, one of them, and the argument is that the U.S. backs dictators going back to the Shah in 1953, to Pinochet in Chile, and this allows these critics, both internally, especially on American university campuses and outside, especially the paranoid Middle East, to spin up one conspiracy theory after another about Uncle Sam, pulling the strings and making sure that the world is a deadly place.
yeah. And I mean, personally, I don't put much credibility in their arguments. I mean,
There is none
yeah,
in
arguing a
many of the
case whether it's
theories.
Pinochet or anyone else during the Cold War, the circumstances were very, very different.
Mhm.
And it wasn't always, not necessarily the case, but in many cases, there wasn't much of a choice because of the existence of the Cold War and the threat that the United States felt it was facing. Be that as it may, today circumstances are very, very different, and this rigid adherence to a policy of unconditional support for Israel is badly damaging the U.S.'s reputation worldwide,
And the ICC further adds to that damage. The
and
ICC
and
arrest warrant.
most definitely, and uh, the best that the U.S. can hope is that the three-judge panel delays a decision
Hmm.
for a considerable period of time. I think they probably will rule in favor of issuing the warrants. But if they can delay that, however long they can,
Hmm.
it will be to the administration's benefit, giving them perhaps some time to negotiate a ceasefire and maybe put this war temporarily on ice. And then more rational minds can really get to work on how to address this problem. No one is talking about the fact that Hamas continues to wage this war against Israel. I mean, they are another combatant, and it is very much in their power, as it is in Israel, to decide to end the war. I mean, Israel could end it now
They haven't
just by
released the
deciding,
hostages.
yeah, release the hostages and accept the terms of the last ceasefire with a view toward negotiating a permanent ceasefire and ending the misery of the people of Gaza, not to mention
Hmm.
what the Israelis had suffered. but particularly the people of Gaza right now. It is very much in their power to do that, and no one has talked about that. They
So
steadfastly,
the diplomatic, forget the diplomatic, the narrative war is certainly not being won by Israel. And the ICC judgment really is a huge blow in this narrative war that Israel is already losing.
correct. And like I said, it's been a very bad month for Israel, but especially for Bibi Netanyahu. There's also the decision that Joe Biden made to suspend heavy armaments shipments to Israel.
Yes.
I think that's a temporary decision. I think that will be lifted at a later point when circumstances are deemed appropriate, politically appropriate. And I think that was done mostly to address some of the concerns here within the United States about what might
Students
be
protesting at
necessary.
graduation time do not make a
Yes.
pretty spectacle,
No, they don't. Even
especially in
though
a re-election year.
I mean that they have them. They're doing their encampment thing at the university where I teach now, and it's at not it won't reach the threatening stage that it did at Columbia or at UCLA, but nevertheless it's become problematic for the administration and how they deal with it. But I consider these to be rather short term because no student is going to remain in encampment once the
Summer
semester
vacations
ends. I mean,
start.
people they got summer jobs, they got internships, and, they got travel plans, vacation
Uh,
plans, and so forth. So these have a very short run time, probably through maybe the
but
first week
but
in June.
but the point is that bringing it back to Israel is that the fact that the judgment has come along with Biden's suspension of aid. This is not great,
Yeah.
and this is an this is a continuation in the arc of bad news for Bibi Netanyahu.
Yes. Yeah. And so uh, this is yeah. This war has taken a turn that I suspect no Israeli could ever have foreseen.
Mm.
And it proves the point that I've argued. I've always argued this, but at the start of the war, I was still teaching at the time, and I told my students, I said, wars are inherently unpredictable. They just are. There hasn't been a single war whose events were unfolded as the decision makers had anticipated. The smart people know that and plan for all sorts of contingencies, but even so, you can't anticipate every contingency. And I know that the Israelis did not anticipate this. They might, Joe Biden warned Bibi Netanyahu early on to be careful and how Israel responded to the October 7th attacks. And he pointedly remarked, don't do what we did after 9/11. We made a mistake. And
Yeah.
we did. The United States made a mistake. Now, it was easy for us to say that in hindsight. Um,
You were
uh,
very much part of the government then. You've served in Iraq. You've seen things up close and personal. So you know very well about the various mistakes. And at another stage, we'll talk about that. But yeah, yes, there were massive mistakes, blunders actually.
yes. And a lot of innocent lives were lost as a result of the American
Yeah.
decision. Uh, and so, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I don't know whether I don't think the Israelis anticipated that they would be inflicting the number of casualties and the damage.
Hmm.
But how could you not when you saw these aerial bombardments and then the movement of the troops and so forth and the ridiculous numbers and ridiculous may be an exaggeration because we had a previous discussion about ratios of combatants to non-combatants and I don't know well in no war do we know the actual figure. We don't know the actual figures in Iraq
Yes.
or Afghanistan. They're all estimates, and we won't know it in the war in Gaza. But nevertheless, the fallout I don't think Israel predicted, because at the start of the war, world opinion was on Israel's side. Israel had suffered this awful and brutal attack by Hamas, just unspeakable atrocities committed on some 1,200 Israelis, and then the number keeps going up because the hostages now believed to be dead, and the number keeps going, and it reflects extremely badly on Israel, which is why I think we're now seeing people like Benny Gantz and even Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, is claiming we have to have a day after plan. This can't continue indefinitely. It's unsupportable from the part of Israel, but also for the part of the people of Gaza.
All right. On that note, Gary, thank you for making the time, and we will see you again very shortly.
My pleasure.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.